Hello. Today I'm going to be talking about the origins of the Cold War. My presentation will look at the 4 key schools of thought which have emerged since people started writing about the Cold War in the 1950s. These 4 schools are orthodox, revisionist, post-revisionist, and now 21st century historians. I will begin by giving a brief summary of the Cold War period itself, before moving on to examine in more detail the 4 schools of thought which have emerged. Taking a look at different historians from each time period, I will look at how their views differ from one another and the importance of this constant revisionism. I will finish up by looking at the relevance of the Cold War to the continued nuclear threat that exists in the 21st century. August 2015 saw the 70th anniversary of the US nuclear attacks on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Looking at publications and news reports from last week on the days of the anniversary, I will look at how people of today feel about the continued existence of nuclear power and whether it really is still relevant. Dominating talks over international affairs for most of the second half of the 20th century, the Cold War was a time of political and military tension between the world's two great superpowers in the years immediately following the end of the Second World War. These superpowers were, of course, the United States, led by President Harry Truman, and the Soviet Union under communist leader Joseph Stalin. Although allies during the Second World War, these were 2 very different nations. The US was a capitalist democracy, whereas the Soviet Union was an autocratic state under a communist dictatorship. When the Second World War was finally coming to an end in 1945, there were talks about the best way to handle a post-war Europe. As well as coming to a cooperative conclusion about the best way to help rebuild a weakened Europe after the devastation of the war, there was debate about how to handle the fallen Nazi state of Germany. The leaders met at the Potsdam Conference during the summer of 1945 to discuss these issues and come to a decision concerning the issue of borders and territory in the post-war years. As well as having to decide upon these issues, Truman and Stalin also had a clash over a general world view. Stalin favoured a sphere of influence approach, taking the view that each nation would have a level of cultural, economic, military, or political exclusivity concerning the interests of their neighbours. Truman, on the other hand, preferred the more traditional American approach of universalism. Universalism meant that every nation would work together to create a peaceful, cooperative world in which everyone strived for the same end goal. And so, from these clashes in opinion and post-war pressures, it is clear that tensions between Stalin and Truman in the years leading up to the end of the Cold War were high. Of course, the thing that most people think about when discussing the Cold War, whether historians or not, is the atom bomb and the introduction of the world to nuclear power. The creation of the bomb was surrounded by secrecy and suspicion, and this only added to its threat. When President Truman finally launched the nuclear attack on Japan in 1945, the world was shown the sheer damage that could be done by a single weapon, as tens of thousands of Japanese civilians died in an instant. This order by Truman to drop the bomb on Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki began a nuclear arms race. Because of the secrecy surrounding the creation of the bomb, and Stalin remaining largely unaware that it existed until the attack on Japan, suspicions and distrust between the Soviet Union and the United States continued to grow. In the years immediately following the end of the Second World War and the dropping of the bomb, tensions between Truman and Stalin continued to rise. The disagreements over what to do with the post-war Europe and a clash in ideologies was the root cause of these tensions. Truman quickly began to fear the spread of communism by the Soviet Union. He believed that Stalin wished to expand his communist ideals into Eastern Europe and then make his way into the West. On March 12, 1947, President Truman announced a series of policies that emphasized the fact that the US would do anything in its power to stop the spread of communism. Known as the Truman Doctrine, this announcement of March 1947 soon became known as the official declaration of Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. The doctrine introduced the policy of containment, which was a series of measures that aimed to stop the spread of communism. It also announced that the US would provide any support needed, whether military or economic, to nations faced with the threat of Soviet domination. So, what actually started the Cold War? Since the war broke out, the key questions that people ask are: who was to blame? Did responsibility lie with Stalin and the spread of communism, or with Truman and ineffective US diplomacy? The second question is, was it unavoidable? Was this an inevitable war, or could it have been avoided through more effective policymaking, communication, and cooperation from both nations? Since the end of the Second World War and the outbreak of the Cold War, it is clear to a historian of today that 4 very clear schools of thought have emerged. Each contains a different group of historians who view the Cold War in a slightly different way and have different opinions on who they believe is to blame, who was at fault, and why it erupted in the first place. The next part of my presentation will go on to look at each of these 4 schools of thought in more detail and take a look at a handful of historians from each of these time periods and their opinions on the origins of the Cold War and who was to blame. The first clear group of scholars to emerge are known as orthodox or traditionalist historians. These authors wrote about the Cold War near its beginning during the 1950s. Orthodox historians tend to stick to the more traditionalist view that it was all the fault of the Soviet Union. In keeping with the official explanation by the United States that they had no choice but to intervene and stop the spread of communism throughout the world. Because of this, Orthodox historians take the view that the Cold War was indeed unavoidable, and nothing that the United States could have done would have prevented the war from happening, down to the fact that Soviet aggression was so extreme. They believe that the reason for the breakdown in cooperation between the two nations in the years following the end of the Second World War was all down to Stalin and his communist ideals. Two notable historians of this time, and 2 that I have chosen to look at, are Herbert Feiss and Thomas A. Bailey. Bailey, who was a professor of history at Stanford University during the Cold War era, published a book in 1950 called America Faces Russia. In this book, he very much supports the official American government explanation that it was the fault of the Soviets and threat of a spread of communism that the Cold War broke out. In the book, Bailey blames Stalin's communist expansion as the reason for the breakdown in post-war peace and cooperation, and thus the outbreak of the Cold War. He praises American tradition and says that efforts such as the Truman Doctrine and later the Marshall Plan of 1948, though noble and necessary, they were, and I quote, painful departures from time-honoured and long-cherished policies of isolation and non-involvement. Thus, Bailey suggests that these policies were created in the United States were a natural, absolute, necessary response to Soviet aggression. He emphasises that they had no choice and unwillingly became involved in the Cold War, something that they would rather have avoided. Vice takes a similar approach. In his 1957 publication, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, The War They Waged and the Peace They Sought, he agrees with Bailey in that it was the Soviet Union's apparent desire to expand communism that was the sole reason for the outbreak of the Cold War. Weiss, who was an economic advisor of international affairs to the US Department of State in the years before President Truman, writes that Stalin wasn't only trying to extend control over neighbouring states, but also throughout the world. He quotes that Stalin created the turbulence in which we are now all living. It is very clear from the works of these two historians that writers of this time were fully supportive of their nation, fully supportive of the United States, and believed everything their government was doing was in the best interests of the American people and an attempt to obtain peace throughout the world. This view lasted until the 1960s, when opinion began to shift and a new revision of the Cold War began. This takes us on to the next school of historians that emerged in the years since the Cold War began. Revisionist historians directly challenge the orthodox writers that came before them. It is part of the nature of history as a discipline that academics are constantly looking back on events and time periods. Someone looking at something through new eyes, in a different time and place, allows fresh opinions to be formed. The 1960s saw a group of revisionist historians emerge who directly challenged the orthodox writers who came before them. Unlike orthodox writers who fully supported decisions being made by the US government, revisionist historians believe that the US policymaking was ineffective and was a large contributing factor to the outbreak of the Cold War. They also examine more closely atomic energy policy during the Second World War and subsequent post-war years as a factor of responsibility for the outbreak of the Cold War. In Schlesinger's 1967 article, he questions whether the Cold War really was unavoidable, asking whether the US had any real authority involving themselves in the political affairs of the Soviet Union. He argues that just as Stalin would have no right to involve himself in the affairs of the United States, so the US have no right to meddle in the affairs of the Soviets. Looking back to the clash in opinion over world order between spheres of influence and universalism, Schlesinger criticises the United States of being too stubborn and not being cooperative enough in coming to a mutual conclusion. Schlesinger also identifies the miscommunication between the two nations as being a key factor in contributing to the breakdown of peace and effective communication in the years following the end of the Second World War. This lack of communication, he argues, resulted in a misinterpretation of signals on both sides, thus resulting in ineffective diplomacy from the United States. Although Schlesinger does ultimately place responsibility of the Cold War with Stalin when he says that even the most rational of American policies could hardly have averted the Cold War, he does acknowledge American responsibility, and this is something that was rare in the orthodox accounts that came before him. Sherwin, on the other hand, fully believes that the United States' atomic policy making is what lies at the heart of the origin of the Cold War. Sherwin again discusses the miscommunication between the two nations and argues that the creation of the atom bomb by the United States caused them to become overconfident, which in turn blurred their diplomacy and affected important decision-making. He questions the president's atomic energy intentions, both during the war, under President Roosevelt, and post-war, with President Truman, who succeeded him. He argues that they were never very sure of what these nuclear policies would be. They didn't know what the most effective post-war use of the atomic bomb was. Sherwin argues that the secrecy surrounding the atomic bomb stretched out to President Truman as well. When he took office after the death of Roosevelt in 1945, Sherwin argues that Truman was unaware of Roosevelt's atomic energy intentions, and no communication had gone on between them. And so both of these revisionist historians looking back, not so long after the orthodox historians, do acknowledge the faults in the policymaking of their own nation. They both accept that the United States was partly to blame and could have had more effective diplomacy, which perhaps could have helped to prevent the Cold War. In all history, there seems to be a swing in academic thought. When one school of thought emerges, another quickly appears that attempts to challenge the ideas of the one that came before it. The same can be said now for post-revisionist authors of the Cold War. Emerging in the 1970s and into the 1980s, these authors argued that the war was a natural occurrence due to the tensions resulting at the end of the Second World War. Post-revisionists tend to argue that the Cold War was completely unavoidable, and there was nothing that either side could have done differently to stop it from happening. They argue that both the United States and the Soviet Union were at fault. Neither was more to blame than the other. This approach is almost attempting to strike a balance between orthodox and revisionist views. One of the most prominent writers of the post-revisionist time is John Lewis Gaddis. Gaddis argues that responsibility lay on both sides and says that neither side can bear sole responsibility for the Cold War. He argues that the Cold War was a result of leftover tensions from the traumatic Second World War, and that it was just a natural occurrence between two world superpowers. In a 1985 paper he wrote, he himself discusses the importance of post-revisionists and discusses the importance of varying opinions surrounding the Cold War. As a historian, he emphasises the fact that it is important that the Cold War is constantly being revised and looked at through fresh eyes. The post-revisionist opinion is the one that is most closely linked to that of the 21st century scholarship that would soon begin to emerge. Because of the swing in academic opinion, the outbreak of the Cold War is a topic which has continued to be debated and studied into the 21st century. Over half a century on from the outbreak of the Cold War, writers of today take a different approach again and take a step away from the blame game of the historians that came before them. 21st century writers emphasise the importance of taking a global, long-term view of the Cold War. They acknowledge the importance of connecting the Cold War's relevance to the continued nuclear threat of the 21st century. In the Cambridge History of the Cold War, Anne Westad emphasises the importance of looking at the Cold War from this global perspective. She writes that the Cold War, and I quote, defined patterns of alliance, models of state building, and discourses of society on a global scale. In other words, she is clear in her argument that we must look back on the patterns of the past to obtain a more effective cooperative future. She also emphasises the relevance of nuclear power in the Cold War to the 21st century. The Cold War saw the threat of total world annihilation, which saw a new, quote, uncertainty about the perfectibility of humankind. This nuclear threat is indeed still as big a threat today as it was during the Cold War. Timothy White, in his review from the year 2000, takes a modern view on the schools of Cold War historians that came before him. Challenging their individual views, White emphasises the importance of 21st century analysis of the subject and suggests that modern writers may benefit from a heightened clarity of analysis unhindered by feelings of loyalty or guilt, which may well have affected the reliability of the historians that came before him. White also stresses the necessity of the teaching of history and says that the Cold War shall continue to be revised and retold to fit the interests of future generations. And so we can see that neither White nor Wested are focusing on trying to place responsibility on the Soviet Union or the United States. Rather, they're taking a more long-term view of the Cold War and examining its significance on today's society. And so it is evident, after examining the 4 key schools of thought in Cold War historiography, that it is a topic still very much in debate. From the orthodox view that the Soviet Union were at fault, to the post-revisionist view that both sides were to blame. This academic bickering and constant swings in opinion have perhaps blurred the facts and made it difficult to conduct a clear and concise examination of the subject. That being said, we have to admire current 21st century writers. Rather than trying to place blame on one side or the other, they take a step back and look at the Cold War from a global, international perspective and attempt to relate the Cold War to the world we live in today. As a student of the subject, it is important to examine the relevance of the Cold War to the continued nuclear threat that exists in the 21st century. The debate over nuclear weapons is one that continues, and calls for disarmament are high. Many are of the opinion that if firing a nuclear weapon is going to ultimately destroy the world, what is the point in their existence? Last week saw the 70th anniversary of the US nuclear attacks on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As images of the completely destroyed cities after the bomb hit the headlines last week, we find ourselves questioning the relevance and necessity of nuclear weapons in today's society. Calls for the disarmament of nuclear weapons are high. In today's world, having learnt from the Cold War and having seen the damage that can be done by one single weapon, we have to question the relevance in today's world. An article published by The Guardian on the 6th of August 2015, 70 years since the Hiroshima disaster, details the sheer damage done and the tens of thousands of people that were killed. It also highlights Japan's mission today to promote nuclear disarmament in Japan and throughout the rest of the world. As the mayor of Hiroshima said in a memorial speech last week, to coexist, we must abolish the absolute evil that are nuclear weapons. Now is the time to start taking action. And so, after an examination of the different opinions of historians in the schools of thought that have emerged since the outbreak of the Cold War, the orthodox, revisionist, post-revisionist, and 21st century historians, we as students can attempt to assess the relevance of the Cold War in today's society. Taking the view of 21st century writers, it is important to look at the Cold War from the long-term global perspective. This is important to help us learn from mistakes, to continue clear communication between nations today, and for effective control of nuclear weapons in the 21st century. We have to ask ourselves, in a world still full of nuclear weapons, are we not still existing in a Cold War atmosphere? Could a Cold War break out again? And if so, would that mean the end of the world as we know it? Thank you.